Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Lamed. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started from the top of our daf. We finished the last daf. We talked about the topic of Macha'a Shelo B'fanav. We're going to return to that topic today. Protesting not in front of the person who's sitting in your land. Is that considered a protest or not? Which we did seem to say yesterday that most people think it is considered protesting. Although it seemed like Rabbi Yehuda didn't think so, because Rabbi Yehuda required the 3 years. So the whole reason the rabbis institute 3 years is that so that if you're far away, you can make it back. Therefore, it did seem to say they insist, Rabbi Yehuda insists that you do it in front of them. We talked about what the language, we ended with Rav Zvid explaining what is the language of a protest. What has to be said? How do you protest? What constitutes a proper protest? And we're now going to start on the second line of today's daf. Amar lo temrule. We're going to have 4 different cases here, and some of the cases are going to be machlokot between different people. If the owner says, though, so now we said, okay, you can protest not in front of them, but you have to do it in front of witnesses. So first of all, you have proof that you actually protested. We'll see later in today's daf how many people, 2, 3, we'll get back to that. But what if, now the whole idea is you don't have to be in front of them, because the assumption is word travels and rumors spread, right? It's very easy. We all know as soon as you tell people something, they'll really know how to keep a secret and they pass it on. So we assume that the person living in your land will hear, and then what's the whole idea? Well, if they hear that you protested, then they'll keep their shtar. If they really bought the land, they'll keep the document. And if they don't keep the document or claim they lost the document, we don't believe them, because they should have heard the protest and therefore should have kept the document as proof that they actually bought the land, and therefore we assume they're lying. So now what if there's a good chance they're not going to hear, or maybe this is a good chance, maybe it's not, that's going to be the whole question. What if when you protested, let's say you're the owner of the land, you heard, you were living far off, you heard someone's living in your land, you protest in front of witnesses, and you said to them, lo temrule, but don't tell the person living in the land. So what's the halacha? Is that considered a protest or not? You said, I don't want word to get back to them. So Amar Rav Zvid, hakamar lo temrule. Rav Zvid said, yeah, that's not a protest, because you said, I don't want them to know. What's the point of a protest if you don't want the person to know? The whole point of protesting is so the person living in your land hears. Rav Papa Amar, l'didei lo temrule, but la'achrine emru. Wait a minute. All you said was don't tell the person living in the land, but you didn't say don't tell anybody. So they'll probably tell somebody else, because that's what people do. People always talk. And that person, chavercha chavrile, that friend has a friend, and chaver de chavercha chavrile, and the friend's friend has a friend, and word will get around, and the person living in the land will hear, and therefore it's actually a legitimate protest. That was case 1, machloket Rav Zvid and Rav Papa. Case 2, very similar. Amrule, the witnesses said to the person who protested, lo amrinanle, we're not going to tell him. Rav Zvid, hakamrule, lo amrinanle. So Rav Zvid again, consistent with his approach. What do you mean? They said they're not going to tell him, so he's not going to find out. That's not a protest. Rav Papa, right? So if you were the person who wanted to protest, you would go find 2 other witnesses that are willing to pass the information on. Rav Papa Amar, Rav Papa says, what are you talking about? Listen carefully to what they said. L'didei lo amrinanle. They said, we're not going to tell the person living in the land. But we'll tell somebody else. And if we'll tell other people, well, your friend has a friend, and the friend has a friend, and basically the word's going to get back to them, and therefore it is a protest. So they have the same machlok and the same debate in both those cases. Amar lehu. Now, what if case 3? We're going to have the owner of the land says, and then the witnesses say. So we're going to have the same thing here. The owner of the land says, lo tepuk shuta. Don't let a word come out of your mouth about what I just told you. Meaning, this is a serious secret. Do not tell anybody. Amar Rav Zvid, haka-amar, lo tepuk shuta. So Rav Zvid, consistent with what he's been saying until now, says, you said, don't let a word come out of your mouth, right? This is even more than the previous case where you said, don't tell the person living in the land. Here he said, don't utter a word of this to anyone. Then really word's not going to get around. And in fact, commentaries say that Rav Papa even agrees in this case. Amrule lo mafkinan shuta. if when you protested, the witnesses said, we are not going to utter a word of this to anybody, Amar Rav Papa, Haka-Amre, Lo Mafkinan Shuta. This time, Rav Papa says it explicitly. He agrees with Rav Zvid. They said, we're not going to tell anybody. Clearly, word's not going to get around. And therefore, that's not a protest. So we have these two cases now where both Rav Zvid and Rav Papa seem to agree that this is not actually a protest because this is a huge secret, or they said, I'm going to keep this a secret. I'm not going to tell anybody. Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yoshua Amal. But Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yoshua comes and disagrees with this last case and says, Kol milta de lo ramya ale deinish, anything that someone else didn't impose upon you, but you imposed upon yourself, Amar lava lavadate. People say it and they don't really mean it. This is interesting. Okay, if someone imposes something on you, or you decide to do something on your own, okay, like let's say go on a diet, or learn Daf Yomi, or right, any kind of something that you take upon yourself, if it's forced upon you, or someone insists that you do it, whether it sounds like it could be another person, or perhaps it means like the court imposes something on you, or it could be even halacha imposes something on you. If it's something halachic imposed upon you, then we assume you're going to keep it. If it's something someone else imposes on you, we assume you're going to keep it because they imposed it, and I guess presuming you accepted it. But when you take on something yourself, okay, and one could argue about this. I would think sometimes if you do something yourself of your own volition, maybe you really mean it more seriously. But if you take on yourself, well, you only have yourself to be, I think of the word, but to have to report to about it. And you might just, not decide, okay, well, I took this upon myself, but you know what? No one's imposing it upon me. What if I just decide I'm going to tell them anyway? And therefore, we don't view this as a case where it'll never get back to them, according to Rav Huna Bereid Rav Yoshua. So he disagrees about this last case. When the witnesses said, we're not going to tell this person, we're not going to open our mouth at all, we're not so sure they're going to keep to that. Again, Rav Papa and Rav Zvid think, of course, that you'll keep a secret. You mean that seriously. But Rav Huna thinks not. Okay, so what we had so far were these four cases, and some that Rav Zvid and Rav Papa disagreed about, and then this last one that Rav Zvid and Rav Papa, or the last two, Zvid and Rav Papa agree about, and Rav Huna has this disagreement about the last case. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman. Second section for today. Rava quotes Rav Nachman as saying, we're back to that topic. He quotes Rav Nachman as saying, if you protest not in front of them, that's a mecha'ah. That counts anyway. You don't have to go straight to their face to protest. Rav Nachman, but after Rava quoted Rav Nachman as saying it, Rava raises a question against Rav Nachman and says, look at our Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, lo amru shalosh shanim, el kedei sheyehe b'aspam v'yachzik shana v'yochu v'yodi'u shana v'yavo l'shana acheret. What did Rabbi Yehuda say? What was the reason the rabbis instituted 3 years? So that if you were far away, it would take time till you got back. Which means, as I said at the beginning of class, that Rabbi Yehuda thinks you actually have to be there physically. Now, we said that the rabbis yesterday, Rabbi Abba Bar Mamel said in the name of Rav in the previous daf that Tanakama doesn't think that that's the case. And Tanakama thinks if you protest not in the presence of the machzik, it works unless you're in this area where you can't get from one place to the other. And then you could say, well, why are you asking a question against Rav Nachman from Rabbi Yehuda? You could say that Rav Nachman holds like Tanakama. But the assumption here is that Rav understands the Tanakama's position differently, doesn't agree with Rav's explanation of it, and thinks that the Tanakama agrees with Rabbi Yehuda about the main point that you actually have to hear. Okay? And that's why also, right, they can't be not in front of them in their presence, and we're not going to get into that. It's just a side point because the Gemara doesn't talk about that. That's why I'm used to saying it's a side point, but it's important to note that you'd have to explain Tanakama differently to be able to really fully understand Rav's question. Because otherwise, again, you could say, why are you questioning Rava from Rabbi Yehuda? You can answer it by saying Rava just holds like, why are you questioning Rav Nachman from Rabbi Yehuda? You could just say Rav Nachman holds like Tanakama. So it must be Rava understood Tanakama differently. But let's just stick with what it says here. So again, Isa Kadata. So that was Rabbi Yehuda. You have to go back, come back, all that. Isa Kadata. If you think that you could protest not in their presence, why do you have to come? Stay there in Aspamya, and protest. So Rav Nachman answers and says, well, you didn't understand Rabbi Yehuda properly. And I'm going to explain Rabbi Yehuda in a bit of a different way. And it's different the way we understood Rabbi Yehuda yesterday or previous stuff. Hatam Eitza Tova Kamashmalan. This was just good advice. In other words, really, Rabbi Yehuda didn't require you to go there, right, to be able to come all the way back and protest in front of the person who's in your land. However, it's better if you do. It's good advice to do it. Why? Because when you come and protest, at that same time, you can then get the land and get your land back, get all the produce back, and deal with it all at one shot. And it's just in your best interest to do it right then, instead of coming much later and trying to get back paid for all these previous years and all that. So it's better if you come in person, but it doesn't mean you have to. So Rava quoted Rav Nachman as saying something, questioned Rav Nachman about it, and then Rav Nachman resolved it. So the Gemara now says, Rava the Rav Nachman, from the fact that Rava questioned Rav Nachman, Michlal, you can infer from here, Rava must have disagreed with Rav Nachman about this general idea. Now, you could just say he was playing devil's advocate and trying to argue against him. But the Gemara assumes Rava must have disagreed with him about Macha'ah Shelo B'fanav and thought, if you don't protest in front of someone, it's a problem. And that's why he quoted the Mishnah and started arguing with him. But that doesn't make any sense, because what did we learn yesterday? Rava said in yesterday's daf, Mecha'ah shelo b'fanav havi mecha'ah. Okay, so Daf Yomi says a protest that's not in front of you, is not in front of the person living in your land, is not a mecha'ah. I'm sorry, is a mecha'ah. So Rava here seemed to say it's not, and there seemed to say it is. So the Gemara answers very simply, Batar deshama merav Nachman savla. Well, what we quoted on Daf Yomi was after he heard Rav Nachman's answer, he changed his mind, okay, and was convinced by Rav Nachman and changed his approach. Third sugya for today. Eshkachinu Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina l'talmidav de Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina bumps into, or happens to be with a bunch of students of Rabbi Yochanan. And Amar Lahu, he says to them, Mi Amar Rabbi Yochanan mecha'ah b'kama. Did Rabbi Yochanan ever tell you in front of how many people you need to protest? Okay, so after dealing with, what if the witnesses say we're not going to tell the person, or the person says don't tell the person, or don't tell anybody? Okay, we dealt with, again, returning to the topic of, does it have to be in front of them or not done in front of them? Now we go to, well, you have to protest in front of people. There have to be witnesses, someone to see that you protested. So in front of how many people do you need to do this? And in fact, you might recall, you might not, but in the 4th chapter of Gittin, we had all machloket if you want to cancel a get before the get gets to the woman and you want to cancel it, in front of how many people can you cancel it? It's a very similar sugya. There's the same machloket there, 2 or 3. We're going to see here also 2 or 3. And the issues perhaps are similar. And we're going to see there's going to be a machloket here, 2 or 3. And then there's going to be 3 different ways of understanding what the root of the machloket is. So one of the issues there, which is going to be one of the main issues here, is 3 people, we assume the woman will hear, and then she won't get remarried, and then her children won't be mamzerim, right? We're always worried the woman might not hear. She'll think she'll receive the get, but it turns out the husband had canceled it before she received it. And then there's a concern she'll go get remarried thinking she's divorced, and 2 is not going to be enough because, okay, we're going to talk about, right? Does word spread with 2 people or with 3 people? How quickly does word spread? How many people do you have to say something in front of if you're going to assume the word's going to spread? So perhaps that's a machloket, and perhaps it's similar to what we saw there, but it's not exactly parallel, but it is very similar. So here we have 2 students of Rabbi Yochanan, and interestingly, each one quotes Rabbi Yochanan as saying something different. This is not a surprise. This happens a lot. Rabbi Chia bar Abba amar Rabbi Yochanan mecha'ah b'fnei shnayim. 2 people. Rabbi Yavau amar Rabbi Yochanan mecha'ah b'fnei shlosha. So Rabbi Chia bar Abba says 2. Rabbi Yavau quotes Rabbi Yochanan. Right? They both quote Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yavau quotes Rabbi Yochanan as saying 3. First way to understand this machloket is lema. Why don't we suggest that b'derabba bar Rav Huna kamiflagei? They have a machloket about whether they agree with something Rabba bar Rav Huna said, which is to Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna. We're now going to turn to Amud Bet in the middle of this sentence. Komilta dimid amre ba'apei tlata anything you say before three people, it's not an issue of lashon hara. If you ever learn laws of lashon hara, it's a very famous halacha that if somebody says something in front of three people and then you repeat it, it's not lashon hara. Because if they said it in front of three people, the assumption is that everybody knows. Now, there's a big debate here among the commentaries. What kind of lashon hara are we talking about? Lashon hara, there's a whole bunch of different categories. There's not nice things about a person. There's, something a person did, right? Like, let's say someone does something in front of three, or screamed in a really not nice way, and then you told that to somebody else, right? Is that what we're talking about? Because that's like negative things about the person. Maybe we're only talking about something that's neutral, like rechilut, right? Like just saying, oh, did you know so-and-so is dating so-and-so? Now, if it's public information, which would mean what? They said it in front of three, then we assume if they told three people, and the assumption is that they know it's going to get around, and therefore you can do it. Okay, and maybe it's only talking about rechilut. There's a whole bunch of other opinions about exactly which type of lashon hara we're discussing here. But in any case, it's an interesting concept that once you say something to three people, everyone's going to know. So, Manda Amar Bifnei Shnayim, the one who says in front of two people you need to protest, and only two, lately, the Rabba Bar Rafuna doesn't agree with Rabba Bar Rafuna. Rabba Bar Rafuna says only once it's three people. So if we apply that here, well, two is not enough, because again, assuming you don't have to do it in front of them, but right, we need them to potentially hear. Well, they're only going to hear if you say in front of three, because in three people word travels. Well, the person who says two then obviously must not agree that only in three people, by telling three people it travels, this person must think even two people word will travel. Okay, which again, there's logic to say, right? You say anything in front of two people, also they start talking. People don't know how to keep their mouths shut. That's the first opinion. And Manda Amar Bifnei Shlosha to Rabba Bar Rafuna, and the one who says in front of three holds like Rabba Bar Rafuna. And that's the first way to explain the machloket, but the Gemara rejects this, perhaps because they really think that everybody holds three where it gets around, and it's something that comes up in the Gemara many times, that in front of three people, yesh kol, it's itlehu kala, it has a kol, it gets around, people will spread the word. You don't really see it much that people say two people. So the Gemara says, lo, dekule almi itlehu to Rabba Bar Rafuna. Everybody agrees with Rabba Bar Rafuna, in which case the machloket has to be something else. Excuse me. What's the root of the machloket here? Manda amar b'fnei shnayim hasaval mecha'a shelo b'fanav lo havya mecha'a. The one who holds in front of two thinks that it doesn't work if you protest not in front of them. In which case, what are the witnesses there? Where are the witnesses? The witnesses are there when the owner goes to the person living on the land and protests. And then the two people are there just to be witnesses. They're not there to have the word spread. You don't need the word spread because the only way to do it is to be in person. And the one who says before three, and the other one holds, no, it's a mecha'ah, even if you're far away, because again, once you tell three people, well, they're going to hear. So that's another way to explain the machloket. The machloket is not in how, by telling something to how many people will the word spread. It's, do you need it to spread or not? Because you think a macha'ah has to be in the presence of the person living on the land or not. And then if you think so, then that you can do it far away. Well, then you need the word to spread, and that would be three. If you don't think you could do it from far away, then you obviously don't need the word to be spread. You just need witnesses who can testify that you actually did protest, in case you end up having some argument with them later about it. Ibait ema, an alternative. Now here they don't reject option two. They just say, we'll give you an alternative though. Ibait ema dekule alma mecha shelo b'fanav havi mecha. You could also say that everybody thinks you could do it far away. And then what's the machloket? Well, what they're arguing about here is Manda amar b'fnei shnayim savar sahaduta be'ina. The one who says in front of two just thinks you need witnesses. Now, what they really mean here, or what they seem to mean, is your responsibility as the owner is to protest, lodge a protest in a way that you have witnesses that can testify to it. And potentially, and this is the key word, potentially it can get to them, as opposed to, let's say, the Judea and the Galilee, where it can't potentially get to. So you have to make sure that potentially it could get to the person. Because two people could spread the word. We just don't know that they will, or they could go themselves and tell the person. You just need it potentially able to. But what you really need is you just need witnesses that can testify that you actually did the protest. And theoretically, they can get it there and tell the person. But if they didn't, it's not your problem. Like you don't have to ensure that the word gets back. You just have to ensure that it's possible it'll get back. And therefore, all you really need is witnesses so that they can come and testify when you claim later 4 years have passed and you come back and you say, the person says, I've been living here for, or 3 years. And you can say, oh, well, I protested. What do you mean? Now, it's a little unfair to the person living in the land because they didn't know you protested and they lost their shtar already. But the point is, you did do it in a way that theoretically could have gotten there, and therefore, you're good. The one who says in front of 3 says, no, it needs to be known by the person living there. If they don't know, then they're going to lose their shtar, and they're not going to be careful about their shtar because they're going to say, oh, no one protested. So they have to know. And if they don't know, then that's not sufficient. Because again, right, what's the idea? If they heard you protest and they really bought the land, then they're going to make sure to hold that shtar that says I bought the land so that you don't come claiming it's yours. So my opinion makes a little bit more sense that the person living there really needs to know. So that's the third way to understand the debate. So Gidor Bar Menyume had someone living in his land and wanted to protest. He had 3 people here. He saw them, they were sitting, and he protested in front of them. Lishana, okay, we're now getting into a different topic, not in front of how many people, but now, a year later, he came back to protest again. Amrule, they said to him, Lo tzricha, you already protested once. You don't need to protest every year of the 3 years. As long as you protested once within the 3 years, you're good. Or maybe even once at all, and we're going to see. Hachiyama Rav, because Rav said, now notice Rav wasn't clear here, but Rav did say, once you protest the first year, you don't need to protest anymore. Now, he didn't say, what if 4 years passes? Or, what if 3 years pass from your last protest? We'll get into that very soon. But what he did say, at least minimally, within the first 3 years, you only have to protest once. The Ika de Amre, some people say that it wasn't the 3 of them who said it, but Amar le Chia bar Rav, one of them, Chia bar Rav, said, Kevan shmicha, and not that he said it in the name of Rav, although he was the son of Rav, Kevan shmicha shana rishona, shuv ein sarich limchot. Okay, the same thing. So it's just a matter of who said it. Since you protest once, that's enough. Amar Rish Lakish mishum bar kapara. Now here comes the secondary issue. Rish Lakish comes and says in the name of bar kapara, v'tzarich limchot b'sof kol shalosh v'shalosh. At the end of every 3 years, though, you can't let 3 years go by without protesting. So if you protest at the end of year 1, you have to come back and protest at the end of year 4, because otherwise they can come and claim, oh, I've been living here for 3 years. So even though you did protest in the beginning, that's irrelevant at this point. But Tahi be Rabbi Yochanan wondered about this and wasn't so clear and said, what? Wait a minute. You protested year 1 saying, someone's living in my land, they stole my land. And you protested. So now they're a thief. And now we're going to give them a chazaka in your land 4 years later because you didn't protest again. That seems ridiculous. They're a thief. To which the Gemara says, Kazlan, what do you mean? Who says they're a thief? It's their word against your word, right? You claim they stole your land. They claim they bought the land. So why are you calling him a thief? Well, Ela kig Gazlan yesh lo chazaka. So Rabbi Yochanan says, it's possible he's a Gazlan. It's possible this person's a thief. And someone who's potentially a thief or could be a thief, we're going to let them have a chazaka in your land? So it sounds like Rabbi Yochanan thinks that one time is enough. He takes Rav, or whether he heard Rav say it or not, but takes that statement literally. You protest once, that's it. Forever. That's sufficient. And Rish Lakish disagrees. So Amar Rava, what's the halacha? You really have to protest every 3 years. Tane bar kapara, last issue for today. If you protested and then protested another time after 3 years and then protest another time after 3 years, If you had the same claim, each time you came and said, this person's living in my land, I bought it, it's mine, and I don't know what they're doing here. V'im lav, but if you changed your line, ein lo chazaka, then, I'm sorry, yesh lo chazaka, right? So if you did and you kept the same line, then we believe you and they can't have a chazaka. But if you said the first time, they're living in my land, I don't know on what right they're living in this land, this is my land. And then after 3 years, you came and said, they took this land of mine as a collateral and they were supposed to return it, but they didn't. Now, that doesn't sound right. You said first they stole your land. Now you're saying they took your land as collateral. That makes your claim inconsistent, and we don't believe you, and therefore they can create a chazaka. So if we summarize our daf, we had a few different topics. Number one, if you tell people not to say anything, or they say we're not going to say anything, when you lodge a protest and the witnesses say we're not going to say anything, right? We saw the different opinions there. Which cases? There were 4 different cases, and who debated which issues. Then we said Rav quoted Rav Nachman as saying a protest not in their presence is considered a good protest. Rav questioned it from Rav Yehuda's position in the Mishnah, and Rav Nachman resolved it and apparently caused Rava to change his mind about his own opinion. Then we had the question in front of how many people do you need a protest? 2 or 3 we saw from different students of Rabbi Yochanan quoting Rabbi Yochanan. We gave 3 suggestions, although the first one we really rejected, about what the root of the debate is. Then we went to how many times do you need a protest? Only once in 3 years, but potentially you might have to protest every 3 years. And we do paskin that way, even though Rabbi Yochanan didn't think so. And then the last issue was, if you change your claim, though, every 3 years, then already we don't accept your claim at all. With that, we'll finish our daf, wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.